Welcome, everyone. It is wonderful to be with all of you in this virtual space this morning. My name is Emily Jenzik, and I'm the director of the Ignatian Spirituality Center. The Ignatian Spirituality Center is located on Capitol Hill in Seattle in the complex of St. Joseph's Church and School. The ISC, as we like to call ourselves, is a nonprofit committed to nurturing compassion, healing, and justice in our world by engaging spiritual seekers and deepening their connection to God, self, and others. We host retreats, workshops, and spiritual direction services in the Ignatian tradition and vision. And we truly believe that engaging faith inspires transformation. I just want to go over a few logistics for our morning together. We will be recording this presentation and the material, but we will be stopping the recording during small group reflection time. The chat will be open for you to ask questions, and there will be other times throughout where there will be large group conversation and the chat will be open for conversation as well. We will also have the closed caption feature enabled, so feel free to use that or turn it off, however you choose to use that, and feel free to chat me if you need help setting that up or turning it off. So I'm going to now turn it over to Carla Orlando, our wonderful ISC Spiritual Direction Services Coordinator, to center us and to lead us in our time together this morning. Thank you.
Thank you, Emily. Emily is our new Executive Director of the ISC here with 2 years, and also our technical support. She does it soup to nuts. Thank you, Emily. And she's going to pull up our morning schedule just to let you see what we'll be doing today. After we welcome and introduce our presenters, after our prayer, we're going to invite you into small groups. That'll be just for about 10 minutes, for about 4 of you to gather together and reflect on the day, the consolations and graces of spiritual conversation and companionship, before we invite you back together as a large group to open the conversation further, hear your questions, thoughts, comments, and expand our learning. And so before we do that, though, I'd like to gather us for prayer. So I invite you now to just take time to be here and arrive here as seekers and learners, each of us. Taking in a full breath that's given to us in this moment, releasing it back to our beautiful earth and land that holds us today, together with all those who came before us and all those who will follow us, all people everywhere on our beautiful earth today, who we hold in our hearts. And now allow these words from our Pacific Northwest friend and spiritual director, Father Pat Toohey, to bless us on our day and our particular way of being called as seekers. There is an extraordinary peace that comes when we, at some early or late moment in our lives, realize that we don't have to be anyone else than ourselves. We suddenly discover that it is sufficient enough, more than enough, to simply be who we are with our face, our voice, our body, our thoughts, our feelings, our loves, our choices, our walk. There is no need for pretense or apology, no need to follow another's road to find our value. What is there? What has happened? What will happen are the lessons that have been brought us here to this day. Gracious and loving God of our morning, be with each of us seekers as we open our hearts to you. Amen. Now leading our conversation today are 3 dear friends of the ISC. before returning to his Midwest province in 2020 and his call to the University of Detroit Mercy. Jesuit Patrick Kelly taught at Seattle University for 13 years, accomplished scholar and beloved formation director. Dedicated to partnering with lay directors, Father Kelly shares his deep wisdom of the tradition while modeling for us how to gently receive the other into our own tender and expansive hearts. After over 30 years with Franciscan Community, Sheila Barnes continued her teaching, administration, chaplaincy, parish and campus ministry, and co-created Listening with the Spirit, a formation program for spiritual direction here in our region. Sheila embraces the diversity of identity, experience, and background of all seekers, making her a treasured director in our ISC pool. Mary Pauline Diaz-Francine is a first-generation Filipina-American chaplain and counselor, deeply formed by the Ignatian tradition in both her high school and college. Mary Pauline now currently studies theology and culture and dedicates herself to those struggling with poverty and oppression, bringing her joy and love of Ignatian spirituality and spiritual direction for us here today. So thank you, Father Pat, for leading our conversation.
Thank you so much, Carla. Thank you for the invitation, and thanks to Emily. And it's a real delight for me to see so many friends' faces from my time in Seattle. I ended up having to move here in the middle of the pandemic. So I actually never went back to Seattle. The Jesuits packed up all my stuff and sent it so I didn't have a chance to say goodbye to people. And then we start the day with a poem from my friend Pat Toohey, who I'm going to talk to tonight. And so it's a real consolation to be with you all. I'll just dive in and talk about a little bit of the background for how spiritual accompaniment, spiritual direction developed, especially within the Society of Jesus. So probably most of us are familiar with Ignatius's own life, and his life is foundational in one sense, that he had an experiences that God was communicating with him personally and guiding him, especially through the movements of his heart, and that God freed him. I think especially of his experience of scruples, so that he was able to receive God's love and respond to God's call in his own life. And he had the conviction that this was an experience, this being guided by God in the movements of our heart, that was available to every human being. But the point wasn't to have the same experiences that Ignatius had, or do exactly what he did in terms of how he lived out his life. I think his real lasting contribution was that he provided a way for other people, for all of us and others, to pay attention to their own experiences of God, how God is moving in their hearts, and to reflect on it in his spiritual exercises. And the rules for discernment, which are part of the spiritual exercises, play an important role in terms of how to attend. It's really this that makes it possible for us to be here today. It's the spiritual exercises and the retreat that allowed for people in different historical, cultural contexts from Ignatius's own to have their own experiences of coming to new freedom, responding to God's love and call in their lives with their particular personalities, talents, interests, limitations. And so something new could break into the world through the women and men, all people who were making the exercises in very different contexts from Ignatius's. If we just think of the Jesuits, think of someone like Matteo Ricci and how different he is from Ignatius. You know? Who was he spent almost all of his Jesuit life in China, or someone like Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, a scientist, you know, whose whole life was dedicated to reconciling faith and science. Gerard Manley Hopkins, a poet, Pope Francis. But we think of in our own time though, Carla and Emily, Sheila, Mary Pauline, so many of you that I see here on this call, that the exercises, the spirituality allows for something new to continue to break into the world through our lives. So according to John O'Malley, he was my history professor. He's a Jesuit, a scholar of Jesuit history, especially. He writes that the Spiritual Exercises book, it effectively created the retreat. And one of the most innovative features of the spiritual exercises was the role of the person who helped the exercitant, the retreatant, engage in them. And over time, people were discovering if the person who's accompanying the one making the exercises could be helpful during the time of the retreat, then perhaps also outside of the context of the retreat, they could provide assistance as well. And so O'Malley says that because of the spiritual exercises, spiritual direction began to emerge with a new prominence in Catholic contexts as a formal and continuing relationship between the two persons involved. I think, let me see here. I'm just checking for time to see. Maybe I'll just say very quickly, in the interest of time, I think there were some factors having to do with the historical context that Ignatius lived in and the cultural context that also made spiritual direction and discernment important. If you think of monastic life along the lines of Benedictine tradition in particular, it's a very structured life, you know, and it's away from the hubbub of life of society, etc. So there may not be a lot of decisions, a lot of decisions encountering new situations that need to be made. Or if we think of a script of society, a more hierarchical, where one's place is known in the society and what's expected of you. I think those things start to shift with the Jesuits at that time in history too. That within the Society of Jesus, there's a new emphasis on ministry. That the Jesuits come together to go out to be with people where they are in the world. One of the most famous sayings of Jerome Nadal was, when he was trying to explain who the Jesuits were to the early Jesuits, was, "We are not monks, and the world is our house." So being out in the world in very diverse contexts and cultures, Matteo Ricci in China, Roberto de Nobili in India, and encountering new situations and new questions. I think this led to the need for a way to make decisions in new situations in the light of faith. Okay, maybe I'll just, because of time, sort of just say that about that. I don't know if you're aware, the Jesuits were suppressed in 1773, so shut down as a religious order. And then in 1814, they were restored again by a papacy that felt itself under siege by many of the things going on in the modern world. And the Jesuits themselves sort of got into the role of defending the papacy, criticizing the modern world. There was a tendency to move in that direction. And for some time, I would say the Jesuits lost touch with their roots in terms of education, spirituality. Jesuit formation became more monastic in its approach. Retreats were preached retreats, not individually directed retreats. And then with the Second Vatican Council, one of the things that happened at that council from 1962 to 1965 was that religious orders were encouraged to go back to rediscover the charism of their founders and the spirituality, and think through anew how it can be updated for the contemporary circumstances and times in which people live. So that while that research was going on, Pat O'Leary played a really hugely important role in the Pacific Northwest with regard to Jesuit formation, but also communicating that the riches of that new understanding. And then another thing, though, at the Second Vatican Council, there's an emphasis on the universal call to holiness. So that all Christians are called to, to holiness. That it had developed a sort of maybe two-tier or first-class, second-class kind of dynamic in the Catholic Church, and so this was another thing that happened at the Second Vatican Council. And then also, I think especially for SEAL and ISC, an emphasis on ecumenism. So being in conversation with our brothers and sisters in different Christian denominations was encouraged. So in the process of all of this, there was the rediscovery of individually directed retreats. And of the 19th annotation retreat, which probably many of us are involved in. And of course, what went along with that also was a new reappreciation, if you will, of the importance of the one who gives the exercises. Okay, so what about today? Maybe in some ways our times are similar to Ignatius's in the sense that we're living in a time of great change, where we're faced regularly with new situations or questions. I think of the rapid technological advances that have happened during the course of my lifetime, probably for many of us. And the impact of social media, of the grid. We're well aware of demographic shifts in our own country. So diversity and being a part of a pluralistic world, a diverse world, including with respect to religion. I think also, I think of things like I could mention many things here, but populist nationalist movements. We had an insurrection recently, the whole issue of climate change, that we're living through a pandemic, continue to live through a pandemic. So a few reflections. I've been thinking lately, I don't know, it'll be interesting to hear other people's thoughts about this, that people can get lost, it seems to me, or lose touch with themselves in the context in which we're living, their deeper desires or true self that Pat Toohey was referring to it there in his writings. And I think to the extent that this spirituality is a way of attending to one's experience, including one's own affectivity, it can be helpful in this respect. I know my students, I did this just yesterday with them, they tend to really value the examen. I do it in a way that's adapted so they can all participate, whatever their faith traditions are, but they really value it. And I think it's because it provides them with a way to attend to their own, affectivity and how is that related to the events and experiences of my life. And so stay connected to themselves. So I think as spiritual directors, we provide a space for people to attend to their own experiences, to name their own what's happening in their own interior affective life. And so just listening to another can be a great gift to them. Another thing I was thinking about is in a time of great change or complexity, there can be a temptation to look for easy answers and get caught in ideological thinking. Here's a quote from the current Superior General of the Jesuits, Arturo Sosa. Ignatian spirituality is radically anti-ideological because its guiding principles are interior freedom, discernment, and choosing between different options at particular times in specific situations. So I think a spiritual director can play an important role in a time such as this, because she doesn't try to have all the answers, but rather helps a person attend to their own, as I've been saying, experience their own consolations and desolations. The one who accompanies would encourage the person in interior freedom movements, toward interior freedom, and provide support to them as they sift through the different options at particular times in their life. Here's another quote from Arturo Sosa on this topic. If you take Ignatian spirituality seriously, you have a good antidote to ideology. That's even more the case when it's reinforced by the formation and intellectual curiosity that a Jesuit education attempts to foster. So then the third point that I thought I'd mention is interior freedom. And I'm not sure how well known this is. I certainly don't see a lot of it in the discourse in the culture, maybe certainly not outside of, say Jesuit or Ignatian, maybe religious sources. There's a lot of emphasis on freedom to make choices. We hear a lot about the free market in our society and historically, about democracy. The interior freedom is the freedom to recognize, be aware of, and respond to God's love and God's call in our life to love our brothers and sisters. So it's a different reality than what we often hear of. And our attachments, whether it's to a rigidity in thinking, ideology, to power, to maybe security that comes from belonging to a group or a party or a movement or being right, all can get in the way of this kind of freedom, this interior freedom. And yet, I think if there's a lack of interior freedom, it makes it harder to have some of the other kinds of freedom that we talk about a lot, like a democratic form of government, for example. If people will do anything to maintain power, if there's an attachment in that sense, or if people of a certain race or culture feel that they're entitled to rule, this can threaten democracy itself. So it does have, even though it's a spiritual concept, it does have practical effects in society. And so if a spiritual director can help a person to interior freedom, but also perhaps introduce it as a central reality, a fundamental kind of reality in the Christian life, in one's parish or one's faith community, if you begin to speak about this, and this could, I think, be a great service to in our time, to the churches, to our culture. So thank you very much for listening. I look forward to Sheila and Mary Pauline and hearing from everybody.
Thank you, Pat. Thanks for reminding us about the diversity of the Jesuits and the diversity of us, the diversity of our cultures and contexts in which we're called to be holy and to be listening for others and to help them with their own discernment and lives, their intellectual curiosity as a help in our society today. So Sheila, we invite you to respond further. Thank you. Have you got yourself unmuted there, Sheila?
Get it here.
There
How's
you
that? Okay. Get it off the screen. Thank you, Pat. And we will interlock. My background is Franciscan and heavily influenced by the Jesuits, having Jesuit spiritual directors over the course of time and participating in SEAL and the wonderful principles of Ignatius, that some of which drew on Francis's own teaching and life. So continuing to bring it into our times, it's part of why I particularly love the tradition of spiritual direction is that it holds a truth that we all need to be heard. And I think that's some of what Pat was also getting at. And to have someone that can help us hear what's inside, the divine inside of us, however we express that. Stephen Charleston, who is a Native American Methodist minister, writer, said, when we share our questions together, we become our own answers. And I would say we become our own answers in that it's the divine that we get in touch with, that invites us, that responds to us, that then we can respond to. The need in our world, that Pat touched on earlier, in this time of change, I think comes out of a universal longing to be in right relationship, with ourselves, with others, with the world, certainly with God. And as spiritual directors, hopefully then we can bear witness. And we bear witness to that by listening. And listening to an individual, we're also listening to the longing of the world, I believe. It's a world that is in great need of healing. Again, as Pat touched on, all of the political, cultural, relational, institutional upheavals and differences that are going on right now, particularly, not completely unlike the time of Ignatius and before. But it's a world that's in need of healing. Lucy Abbott Tucker, who's one of the founding members of Spiritual Directors International, said just recently that she believes spiritual direction is a powerful means of healing our world. Think about that. With all of what's going on right now. A powerful means of healing our world. When Pat spoke about what happens in the spiritual direction relationship, doesn't just stay there, but that freedom then moves into action. And a step in that healing process, if you will, is to be listened to be heard. Consider going into a doctor's office. You go in and something's going on, something's happening. And you want the doctor to listen to what's going on with you. Not just to jump in and say, oh, well, you have a headache or you're experiencing chest pain, so X, Y, Z. But to know the person that's connected with what's happening. And listening, as we all know, is very hard work. It's not a simple process. How often have we had the experience of trying to speak in someone's talking over the top of us. So they couldn't possibly be hearing what we're saying because they're already formulating and expressing what's going on with them. So if, as someone, a directee, as I am, as we are, if I can be heard, then I'm open to being healed. I'm open to being able to hear another. I'm open to being able to experience the divine. And then in that freedom to respond to it. You know, the third point is around seekers. And again, because of the circumstances of our world, there are more and more people who are looking for a safe place, a welcoming place, a place where they can be respected, a place where they're free from the fear of being judged, where they can be free to be who they are, to be themselves. There are people who are looking and searching for more, for nourishment, for sustenance, because our institutions, our political, cultural, religious institutions are devolving, they're breaking down, and they're not providing for what people need. And so rather than staying, they're continuing to look for a place where there can be healing, where there can be freedom, where there can be growth, where there can be nourishment. And so many turn to spiritual direction, companioning. And sometimes they don't even know what they're looking for. And that's okay. And there are those who, I believe, like many of us here, are looking to reimagine institution, who are looking to be transformers. And in that process, we are transformed. In the process, those that we walk with are transformed. Hopefully, with every encounter we have in spiritual direction, each of us goes away having learned something, having been changed, having been touched in some way. So again, it doesn't simply stay with us, but it can be an extension into our communities, into our world, into our society. I think just to pull it together for this piece for a bit before I hand off here, I ran across a short quote from Henry Nouwen. It says, "We cannot change the world by a new plan, a project, or idea. We cannot even change other people by our convictions, stories, advice, and proposals. But we can offer a space where people are encouraged to disarm themselves, lay aside their occupations and preoccupations, and listen with attention and care to the voices speaking in their own center."
Thank you, Sheila. Thank
Welcome.
you. Thank you for reminding us that we are deep listeners, at the same time, deep healers for people who are looking to be healed in a world that is looking to be healed, reimagined and transformed as we transform ourselves. Mary Pauline, please join the conversation.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation. It's such a delight. I just put everything in gallery view so I can see everyone's faces, or at least a third of your faces. And it's just so humbling to hold what's already been shared, to see people who've been literally directors for me and teachers to me in kind of literal and metaphoric senses. So I'm over the moon. Might take just a beat here. And one of the things that's coming up for me, particularly in listening to Sheila, it's not necessarily planning on sharing this, but above my desk hangs a quote that I hold very dear in what moves me in the world. That's why I keep looking up. It's literally above my desk. And it's from the Buddhist teacher, Reverend Angel Kyoto Williams. It's love and justice are not two. Without inner change, there can be no outer change. Without collective change, no change matters. And as I see some people who I've been grateful to have, to have had as part of my village and do now in this moment. So I think about the call to transformation in these times, an ancient practice in contemporary times. I was thinking about it this morning. I was like, oh, what times, what times? And just reflecting on what Sheila was sharing in particular, noting that these aren't just times of change, but that they're times of tragedy and of reckoning with harm, and that it's not just, the neutral moving between things, but that there's so many of these things that bring up the theodicy questions that people really wrestle with. There are so many of these things that make myself, at least to speak for myself, look for those things to hold on to. So as I was anticipating and thinking about today, so much of what came up for me was a lot of what's been spoken to. And I thought of two images. And one is thinking back to my first experience of being directed in spiritual direction by name, at least, which was actually with someone who's here. So that's a little darling, which was just, I think it was a Lenten, everyday life, 3-day sort of thing at the chapel at SU, or through the chapel at SU. And it was kind of the first time I'd engaged in anything like that with any intention, and I didn't come for any particular reason. Part of, I think Sheila sort of alluded to that, of sometimes we don't know what we're looking for, we just feel drawn. And I remember I have always been a creative person, always really into the arts, and it was the first time in that conversation that someone had just asked me, quite point blank, like, oh, what would it look like that, this person heard how much that was life-giving and God illuminating for me. And they just asked, what would it look like to see the world as God's artwork? I was like, oh, this feels really obvious, but I've never thought of this before. And it's like this very simple thing. You all know how to ask these questions. And I just remember for the next day, my mind being blown, right? It was probably this time of year when the crocuses were coming out. I can still think about these buds on the trees that I viewed a different way that day, and just the beauty that offered. And the beauty of that offering there wasn't just that every year around this time, I get to see the crocuses and think of that small, transformative question. But simply that this person saw how I was already seeing God, saw what I already had in my relationship and in my spirituality, and was able to ask a question, right? Was able to just offer me exactly what I had offered her, but with intention. And I think about that often, of this as a vocation, a practice of, as Father Kelly was even saying, of just allowing people to kind of illuminate what's already in them, but with intention and with, I think what that intention offers people too is this moment of, particularly in times like this, how easy it is to lose sight of our own power, our own gift, our own connection to source, that, and how easy it is to put that power elsewhere, to expect it from other people, to rest that in places we may not be satisfied with later on. So I think that was one of the things that was coming up for me. The other thing that comes up for me is, as I think about sort of the graces and consolations, the images of God that come to me, those were some of the prompts Carla offered us ahead. That, spoiler, you'll also be offered ahead of the small groups. In being drawn and called into seeing ourselves more, we're also seeing our lineages. I'm not just holding myself in the present. I am holding all of you in this room who have formed me. I'm holding the tradition of Ignatian spirituality and everything that has come before, over those centuries that have formed me, the things that have felt very obviously grace-filled, and the parts of that that I wrestle with and have a lot of, this squinting skepticism or wondering about. And certainly the lineage of my family, my culture, and likewise the histories that holds, that are histories of, beauty and strength and joy and laughter and resilience, as well as histories of struggle. An image that I have been thinking about more and more as I, as I think through spiritual accompaniment is, in Tagalog, again, my family is Filipino. In Tagalog, there's a word which is bayanihan. And that sort of speaks to, and I am second gen, so I might mess this up. This is someone else's culture too. Bayanihan is kind of the word for, it's sometimes used as a word for patriotism or like national spirit. A bayani is like a word for a national hero. But what that actually comes through, and bayan is the word for nation, but what it means in connotation, what it means to people, is the notion of a cooperative spirit. So in COVID, when people have done mutual aid food pantries in the Philippines, they've often been called like bayanihan pantries and things like that. And so it has spoken to not just this sense of like nationhood, putting our hand on a flag, but nationhood, what does it mean to have a cooperative, collaborative community spirit, to be the kind of bayani or hero who is not a hero based on their own image and standard, but a hero because of how they give back to the community, because of how they serve and cooperate. And what I love so much about this phrase is the history of where it comes from is tied to this tradition. I know this is an old tradition. I don't know if rural communities still do this at all, but in a time, which was actually not that long ago, when more homes were made out of bamboo nipa huts, when a family would move homes, what would happen was the whole community would wrap around and like literally move that home, would put it up on stilts and carry it over to the next town. And the thing about that too is that, it wasn't that people were moving homes because they wanted a better view or like because somebody got a job on the other side of the village or anything. It was people move homes because typhoons and high tides and floods and things like that happen all the time. And, I've been thinking so much this week about living in a metaphorical typhoon in some ways. And I don't know, the New York Times came out with that dreadful article about typhoons and like the big earthquakes. So there's literally some of that for sure. But thinking about, in this moment of crisis, needing to be carried from one place to another, and a whole community, not even building a new home, but putting what this family already has on stilts and bringing it over. So I think about that image a lot. I think there's I mean, there's a Ram Dass quote that I keep thinking about now that I also like, which is something along the lines of, we're all just walking each other home. And I also like thinking about, like, we're also all just walking each other's homes. You know, I carry in this story I've built with other people, with, you know, the land and places and experiences I've had. I carry something here that I would not want to completely tear down, but that there are corners of it, that there are, you know, some of the pieces of this home that I've built, that we've built, that that I haven't looked into the dust of it in a while, or I have no idea what the underside looks like, and I need people around who are lifting up those stilts. It's so much of what Sheila said resonated, in particular around the work that I actually do is like the job work that I do is deep listening with communities who are navigating rupture. So stuff around political polarization and even just kind of internal conflicts, navigating intergenerationality. And a lot of what we do is, a lot of what I end up doing is deep listening with leaders about the question that we ask everyone is, what needs healing here? And sometimes thinking about kind of the Ruby Sales quote of, where does it hurt? Sometimes, especially when it's the elephant in the room, like sometimes that's whether it's explicitly asked or implicitly underneath the thought bubble somewhere, sometimes we have to look directly at these moments of what needs healing and where it hurts. What we do with those communities is a lot of getting people to investigate and share their own stories, because we know, as Sheila was highlighting, that those stories are, and our ability to relate and connect with each other is what becomes powerful, not only in the particular moments of the conversations we have with each other, conversations you might have with directees, but the way that every year I think of those crocuses and those tree buds again, and the way that that one moment shapes and gets reshaped, and the way that these stories from my ancestors shape and get reshaped, the way that these stories of the Jesuits hundreds of years ago shape, get reshaped, get struggled with, get brought forth, mean new things because of the ways that you all have touched them too.
Thank you, Mary Pauline, for being God's artwork for us today, for reminding us that we have our power and our gifts, that we are the Via Nihan, and that cooperative spirit, that way that we are heroes and servers and walk each other over. We're going to continue to create space for one another, as Sheila has invited us to tap into that radical freedom that Father Pat has reminded us about by sharing in small groups. We're just going to do a little bit of small group today, just to touch on where you see the gifts and consolation of spiritual conversation, and then come back and join the large group again for expanding the conversation further. So Emily, would you help pull up our questions? What are the graces or consolations you have noticed with the process of spiritual direction, either as a spiritual director or directee, or how have you experienced grace or consolation in the context of spiritual conversation in your life? If you have a little time in your small group, you might talk about what are some ways you think of the director-directee relationship, or can it be helpful or important, particularly in our context? Okay, so we're just talking about the graces and consolations and the values of it in our context. And before we go into small groups, just a few reminders. In this next slide, we'll show you that we only have 10 minutes, so maybe plan for 2 minutes a piece in your groups of 4. Share in alphabetical order and choose to pass if you prefer just to listen today. And then you might share at the end with a thank you, so that you prompt the next speaker. We always avoid crosstalk, conversation and responding to others until you have time at the very end, perhaps. All sharing in our small groups is held in confidence, and enjoy any of those questions, the third one, if you have time. So right now we're going to send you off into those small groups with these questions, and we'll pull you back in about 10 minutes. So look at your clocks and your watches, your computer screen timekeepers, and we'll see you back in about 10 minutes. Thank you, Emily, for sending us all into small groups. And as we were coming back, both Sheila and Father Pat had some gems to begin our conversation. And we invite any of you to offer a question or comment, observation. But Sheila, why don't you start? And Father Pat, why don't you follow her with those additional thoughts?
Right. Well, a couple of thoughts. One, in terms of discernment, is that we try to learn how to live a discerning life. So it's not just I get up to a particular point and I have to make a decision. Decision is part of it, but if I'm living a discerning life, hopefully those elements that Ignatius particularly has provided us with will make it a little bit easier, not easy, but easier. And my other, I think, lifelong experience and thought is that grace does not always feel good. Doesn't mean it's not grace. It just doesn't always feel very well.
Thank you, Sheila.
Welcome.
Yeah, so we were having our own group conversation, and in light of what Sheila just shared about, I was thinking about the ongoing nature of this process for every single one of us, you know? And I was saying that sometimes I have found in my own life when I'm in over my head and I don't understand maybe what's going on, or I'm experiencing desolation of some kind, and it can be very difficult kind of time. But over time, maybe I get a sense of how God is present and calling me. And then lo and behold, somewhere down the road, I'm able to accompany someone else who may be going through something similar, and in a way, almost like if I didn't go through that, even though it was painful, I might not have been able to walk compassionately with the other person. So we're all kind of on the pilgrimage.
Thank you, Pat. Were there other questions and comments, observations that came from the small groups? We'd love to hear from anyone who's a current spiritual director or somebody who's curious, just curious about this tradition. Maybe you have questions about it that we could offer some wisdom about. So we kind of open it up now. And if you'd like to share something, just unmute and offer from your place in our circle of squares today.
Hi, my name is Lloyd Backtas, and in the short amount of time I had in the small group, I've always told my spiritual director, amazing man, Tim Malone, that I felt like this journey was very lonely, right? Mm-hmm. It's like you're kind of on this path and you're just like, you don't know which way is up, right? But there's a person there with you. And then to even just share that space with like four other people, it felt like I'm kind of home, in a weird, it's like we're all on a journey that I think is uniquely made for you. That's inside all these interior movements, right? And I think because I've been working with Tim for over like 2 years, like before the pandemic and going through this, and just to see that I'm not alone was a very comforting thing, right? To see that there is a bunch of journeymen and women going through this, like, yeah, especially like, it just felt very lonely for the longest time. and to see all the faces here, like that's quite the gift today. So thank you for just setting this up and really having a community around something I didn't know existed. So it's a gift today. So thank you.
Thank you, Lloyd. Thanks for joining us, being part of us today.
Thank you, Lloyd.
I have a question for Patrick Kelly. What you said about interior freedom, no ideological alignment, discernment, and that kind of being a shifting ground depending on where you are in your journey in your life. One question that I've always had is, how do my prayers help others? I know they help me, but seriously, how do my prayers help others?
Well, I don't know that I can answer, concretely with respect to a given prayer, or I think I guess the way I would think about this is I do believe in a God who's present and active, and is as Ignatius would say, laboring, loving concern for God's people. And so I guess I think of this, my dad has been having health problems recently. And so we often pray for him here in the community, or I pray for him in the daytime. I'll just mention something he said. Actually, I brought my mom and dad communion a couple of weeks ago, and we did a kind of impromptu service. It was after the Super Bowl, actually, because they had already eaten snacks, and I couldn't give them the communion before. So I was leaving after the Super Bowl, and we did impromptu communion service. And after they received communion, he said, "Can I say something?" I said, "Yeah." And he said, "If it be God's will, I would just pray that the doctors could find out what's wrong with me, and that we can, it could be fixed." And I was very touched by that prayer. And maybe that's the way we, I pray too, or we pray too, for other people that we love and care about, that if it be God's will that this person would experience healing at this time. I don't, because I'm not around everywhere knowing how God exactly I don't know if there's a direct intervention, or of the Holy Spirit in a particular case, or not, or how that might work. If God works through the medical professionals too, etc. But I wonder too if maybe there's something about community. Like when I brought communion, that's kind of a symbol, I think, for my mom and dad. They aren't able to go to, of that they're part of a community, ideally a community of love and support, that embodies something of who God is. And so somehow just that in itself might touch a person's heart. And even in a situation where the physical illness might not be getting better, perhaps their spirit could be touched or healed in some way. They have a sense of God's presence with them, a sense of peace, that no matter what happens, Christ is with me in this time. Just a couple thoughts.
Thank you for your question, Sheila.
Yeah, I was going to say, if I could just build on that a little bit, to say, if I look at prayer as energy, and energy that is contained in the Spirit, as we pray for whatever God's will is, it's the trust that that prayer, that energy is given to God, and God does with it as God needs to do on behalf of those that we pray for. It's not always apparent what the outcomes are. Wish it was. And at the same time, that trust that if I can offer this energy on behalf of and trust it to God and trust it to Spirit and let go of it, holding those folks close and trusting that that energy that I offer, that prayer on their behalf, will accompany them.
Thank you, Sheila.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you.
I think what I might just add a brief thing too, and it's that sometimes we pray for one thing to go one direction and it actually hits me in another, right? That our prayers are also personally transformative in a way that hopefully allow us to show up differently. When even just something very basic, like if I pray in advance of seeing a family member I have a lot of trouble with, I can sometimes be a more tolerable and empathetic person to that person than I might otherwise, right? That in my prayer, I'm also listening and listening for, not just asking God for things, but listening for where I might show up, where I might offer accompaniment, where I might offer comfort or what have you to whomever I hope my prayers are directed for. So I think just want to add that additional nuance there too.
Thank you, Mary Pauline. Other questions or comments, either from you or your small group?
Just want to say I appreciated all of the presentations, so much wisdom. And I love what Sheila said about when we share our questions together, we become our own answers. And I think that's key in the spiritual direction conversation, that we bring to the light of God these deep, dark things that we've held within us, and things become clearer just because of holding them to the light. So thank you for that, Sheila.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Kathy.
Maybe I'll just add something that came out in the conversation. I love these presentations in this panel. I'm just so grateful. And this community, thank you for Lloyd for mentioning what the beauty of the community is. It's a real gift today. It strikes me as both someone who's received direction and offered direction. I remember, and this event reminded me, I almost felt like, oh my goodness, this is an amazing piece, like tool, instrument, dimension of my being able to walk my journey of faith. And so it's almost hard for me to think of living a really fruitful, for me, journey without spiritual direction in some form, because it almost feels like it fills a hole. It's not just my own personal prayer. It's not just my large communal prayer. It's this moment when face to face I can speak about my journey with God, and someone really listens and helps me discover something inside. So it almost feels like spiritual direction, it should be practiced universally. And instead of it's this very specialized thing, it's a universal tool, I think, and maybe we're all a part of something that can keep growing and growing and growing as a way for people to discover God in their life. Beautiful to be part of and beautiful to be here today.
Thank you, Joe.
I have just one quick question, kind of piggyback onto that. So I have a Bible study group, and whatever I'm learning, I'm teaching my Bible study group. And I have a spiritual director now for about 3 months, and I'm excited about that, and I want to share that, but I'm scared to kind of share it. Like, I don't want to mess him up either, you know? So do you guys have any suggestions on how to start sharing spiritual direction with other people?
An excellent question. Sheila, do you have thoughts on that? Maybe Pat?
You know, if there is something in, you know, the group that you're sharing with, Dawn, that, you know, strikes you that you may have experienced in spiritual direction, it's like that can be kind of a natural lead in to say, you know, when I saw my spiritual director, this was one of the things that it reminded me of, or this reminds me of that. And doing that over time, where you can genuinely find those connections, it may pique people's interest. So that it becomes a natural part of conversation, not something that you want to foist on somebody, but, you know, something that you can offer. And if they, you know, accept the invitation, it's like, oh, you know, maybe tell me a little bit more about this. So you keep talking about this spiritual director. What the heck is that? You know, and that sort of thing, where you can do it in a pretty natural way. And I think by living your own life authentically, people will pick up on that. Yeah. And if I can just make a comment to what Joe was saying, you know, the hope, the wish that, you know, I think that's what Lucy was talking about. The world can be healed through companioning, through direction. And to give you hope in that, I'm taking a class right now from Lucy, and she was actually one of my mentors. And there are over 300 worldwide in that group. It's for supervision. And so it's a group of over 300 and some people worldwide who are spiritual directors, who are offering that in such a wide variety of traditions and forms and ways. So I think there is that hunger, and it's happening.
Hopeful. That's beautiful.
Yeah. Dawn, I'm sorry, did that answer your question?
It did. Yes. Thank you so much. I appreciate that.
Mary Pauline.
Could I just say,
Pat.
just thinking about what Dawn had asked, I don't know, you know, the group that you're meeting with well enough and where they're at, but I wonder if there might be a way of doing a Bible study that itself introduces them to Ignatian spirituality, in the sense of inviting them to attend to, as they pray with this passage from the gospel, what's happening within them, you know, interiorly, affectively. After all, this is the basis of you know, Ignatius's, of the exercise. That's what the exercises are. So in a way, you could I mean, you don't want to surreptitiously be giving the exercises, or I guess, but I mean, but I think there might be a way to do that that you know, might enrich the process itself, but also could lead people to ask about where does this come from, or.
Thank you.
Thank you, Pat. Any other thoughts? Mary Pauline, I don't know if you have a response, or maybe there are other questions. B, Sister B, do I see your hand up?
Yes,
Yeah.
you do see my hand.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, B.
Thank you, Joe, for that lead in, you know, and I was sharing in my group is I had spiritual direction way, way, way back when I was just on the edge of discerning which community to enter, but never thought of it as spiritual direction. Just visiting was a person, a friend that I knew really well. And then, you know, because of religious life, being in spiritual direction for so many years, and then also giving. But I can't help to wonder, this is a gift that we all have of spiritual direction and of giving. But from perspective of working on the margins. But yet what Sheila said is that deep listening. But there are people, the homeless, mentally ill, those in large, who want to really be listened to. People in prison, and I know SEAL have really outreach. How are we touching them? How are we helping them to realize the gift that they are of God when the world doesn't say it's a gift? So it's a challenge. I know there's not a clear answer, but it's a challenge.
I'll just mention the last couple of years I was in Seattle. I was working with Jennifer Kelly and the retreats in the prison in Monroe, and I was really touched by what was happening there in the lives of the men. So that was and they were Ignatian retreats. So, you know. And it really built community among them. There were some tensions between Catholics and Protestants, and there was concern about that, but they started to talk about one another as brothers in the brotherhood, and they really respond wonderfully to Jennifer and her ministry. Just a quick thought, something that I'm assuming it's still happening. I hope and pray it is.
Yeah, it's coming out of COVID soon. But I thought I would mention similarly, thank you, Sister B, for this. The Ignatian Spirituality Project I've learned about is bringing the exercises to the homeless around the country, including in Seattle, but it's originally out of Chicago, the Ignatian Spirituality Project. So it's beautiful to see these other ways that the Ignatian spirituality being brought into these communities. So thanks for bringing that up, B.
I think, Victoria, did you have a question?
I was going to say in response to your comment that you can't give the exercises surreptitiously, that I think that's what Ignatius did. He would start walking with people, and I don't think it was always so obvious what he was doing. But I think that there are many ways that we can do it surreptitiously without being disrespectful, just by in our relationships. Even talking about the exercises, talking about our relationship with God, saying things that might invoke or evoke questions. Children, I've got some young adult children, and I just kind of make sure I plant a few seeds along the way. They haven't planted them in their own lives yet, but there's always hope. But so I think that, surreptitiously may be too strong a word, but I think that we can do it in many different ways in the course of our lives.
Thank you, Victoria. Thank you, Victoria. Could I just say, I'm probably a little oversensitive as a Jesuit, especially working in a university context, about not wanting to, impose and etc.
Mary Pauline, you had something to share.
Yeah, I think what comes up for me in hearing Sister B and Victoria, a lot of resonance of there's beauty in offering these things in formalized context and in community with other folks. And there's also, if spiritual direction is a vocation, if it's a gift that, we all have, even those of us who don't have that title by name, then how are we bringing those practices of listening to the people we run into at the grocery store or on the sidewalk or what have you? I think that's a part of what Sister B was sharing that sticks with me, and what Victoria was saying too, of a lot of the same questions I would ask people as a chaplain are the ones that I ask my 12-year-old niece, that even if I think back to, and I hope none of this is received abrasively. But even if I think back to Dawn, your question about like, how do I bring this up without being, daunting? And I think it is daunting. And it makes me wonder what it is about this that feels daunting and inaccessible and too much, or asks for too much, or what about this feels like it needs to be woven out of our everyday lives, taken out of our everyday lives.
Thank you for that reminder, Mary Pauline. And the good news here is that this conversation is going to continue in April, and we hope you return with Sheila and Father Pat, and we hope Mary Pauline will come back with Joe Cousins, another young voice, young man theologian from Bishop Blanchette. So we'll continue this conversation and start looking at the experiences and applications. So we'll kind of, this is a good launching place for that time in April 22nd. And if you haven't registered, please do so. Before I close us in prayer, I know that the beloved ISC members are here, Kelly Hickman and Emily, thank you so much, along with Sheila Barnes, Father Pat Kelly, Mary Pauline Diaz-Francine. Thank you for your presence to us, as well as your words of wisdom. We love your companionship, your friendship to us. We look forward to more of that. We also want to invite you to the Novena of Grace. It's a tradition here at the ISC that has been loved for many, many years. It's coming back to us in person, as well as available online. So join us for that too. It starts on March 8th. And some fine friends are there in front of you there, seen in that page. And then again, our part 2 of this series will be happening in April. And I'd like to close us just before you scoot away on your day, just to take another deep breath and listen to our friend, Father Pat Toohey, my dear friend Carolyn Hickman, who's here today. She was in my role. She shared this with me for the first time at one of the ISC gatherings, through the ordinary. It is through the ordinary, through ordinary eyes and hands, through our flesh and blood and the flesh and blood of our children, that a great power comes into the world. Through simple lives, humble and forgotten, the Spirit races through the world, touching everyone, touching everything with a sovereign dignity, with a forgetfulness of self, surrounding all with an incomprehensible silence that for those who hear it becomes the sound of spirits singing. And it does not matter whether we move forward or backward in time, flesh and blood are there, and the silence, and this immense song, which we too can sing, if only we allow it to enter our ordinary bodies and change us into something entirely new. Blessings on your day, friends. Enjoy the beauty of the winter time before spring comes, and we'll see you again in April. Take care.